Sign up to The Economist for in-depth curated expert analysis of world events and topics ranging from business and culture to science and technology. You'll get the weekly digital edition, online-only articles, curated newsletters on politics, the markets, science, culture, and China, and full access to The Economist Podcast Plus. The Economist is independent journalism for independent thinking. Go to economist.com and get your first month free.
Today on CityCast Houston.
Is sex trafficking an issue here in Harris County?
Yes, always has been. It's one of the things that Houston, Harris County is known for around the country.
Human trafficking steals freedom for money. Worldwide, global profits in the slave trade top $150 billion each year.
For the next several weeks, we'll be shining a light on the issue of modern-day slavery, people for sale.
For years, stories like these have come across our feeds as we've continuously led the nation in human trafficking cases. Our news channels have given us an outline of what's going on, but there's much more to the story. Beyond those headlines lies another form of human trafficking that isn't talked about as much. Dr. Mollie Gordon is the medical director of the Anti-Human Trafficking Program at Baylor College of Medicine, and she joins me today for part 1 of our special series. This is Human Trafficking in Houston, Beyond the Headlines. It's Thursday, May 16th. I'm Rahil Ramzanali, and here's what Houston is talking about. Dr. Gordon, thank you so much for taking some time out and joining us on CityCast Houston. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thanks. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. It is our pleasure. And it's such an important topic that we wanted to bring you on for. So before we jump into what is happening right now with human trafficking, can you lay out the different types of trafficking that are common in Houston? And where do the victims usually come from in those types of trafficking?
That's a great question. Well, when we think about trafficking, we want to make sure that we have our definitions straight. So when we think about trafficking here in our program, we think about it through what's called the AMP model, A-M-P. And what that means is there has to be an act, a means, and a purpose. An act is the recruitment, harboring, transporting, and receiving of a person. And that sounds like movement, but what that really is a attachment between a vulnerable person and someone willing to exploit them. And then through a means of force, fraud, and coercion, that person has a purpose, which means they are sold for labor or sex. If you're talking about children under the age of 18, then they cannot consent or assent to commercial sex work. So any commercial sexual act of a child or the exchange of sex acts or sexual services for something of value, whether it's food, clothing, money, housing, is considered a form of human trafficking when it comes to minors. The Polaris Project, which is the National Human Trafficking Hotline, describes numerous types of trafficking. We think of them in sort of 2 large categories, either sex services trafficking or physical labor trafficking, but not uncommonly, they can occur together.
So Houston, unfortunately, has always been a city where the human trafficking numbers have been really high. And in fact, we've seen reports where we are the worst city in the nation for it. Why is it so bad here specifically with your experience?
The majority of the patients that we see are not foreign-born nationals. Over 90% of them are born and raised here in Houston. So this is very much a city problem, a Houston problem, and also has a very large Houston solution. So, why are those numbers so high and how do we get that reputation? Well, that reputation comes from data from the National Human Trafficking Hotline that compared the 100 most populous U.S. cities from 2007 to 2016. And Houston had the number 1 amount of calls. So the reason people call the hotline is because they know to call the hotline. And that comes from a lot of outreach through our law enforcement, outreach in our community through schools and churches, outreach from nonprofits that go and educate our community about human trafficking and the hotline number to call. So, whether or not it is a, quote, hub of trafficking any more than any large populous city is still unclear. I think that it gets that reputation because we do a lot of tremendous outreach here in the city and that people know the hotline number to call.
Well, that's good to hear that victims are calling and we are doing a lot of outreach. We're going to dig into two types of trafficking. And of course, sex trafficking is one that is such an important topic to talk about. And we know about what's happening here in the city with it. But one of the underreported stories has been labor trafficking. Tell me more about this and how it happens and where the victims are transported or forced to work.
So there is some theoretical data around the prevalence of this. The Human Trafficking by the Numbers Initial Benchmarks of Prevalence and Economic Impact in Texas was a report that was put out by Dr. Noel Bush Armendariz at the Institute of Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault at the University of Texas in 2016. And she and her team developed an estimation of how many persons who are perceived to be exploited in the state of Texas. And according to their model, there's over 313,000 victims of human trafficking in Texas, 234,000, the majority of which are victims of labor trafficking. There's an estimated 79,000 minors and youth who are victims of sex trafficking in Texas. And so while sex trafficking is an important issue and does get a lot of attention, we do believe that labor trafficking is very prevalent in the state of Texas and likely underreported. That could be for a few reasons. Number one, a person may not know they're being labor trafficked. They may think they're being abused or maltreated at work, but they may not know that they are in a situation where they're actually being exploited and it meets the international and federal definition for trafficking. It may also be that people aren't asking about it, so they don't know where or who to disclose to. Healthcare providers may not be screening for labor trafficking. They may not know that they have the right to go to the police or a trusted authority to report this. They may fear retaliation. So people may fear reporting trafficking. We know that trafficking occurs in all sorts of industries: domestic work, traveling sales crews, restaurants and food services, forced panhandling, the agricultural industry, the health and beauty service industry, hotels and hospitality, landscaping, even the healthcare industry. And so we know that there is a lot of diversity of industry in the state of Texas. A lot of people think about labor trafficking first and foremost when it comes to things like domestic servitude, agricultural work, or construction, or sort of the big areas where we see a lot of intersectionality of labor trafficking and forced labor.
Wait, so you're telling me all of those industries that you just named are industries where labor trafficking is occurring? Because like many people listening right now, I'm thinking, yeah, it's the agriculture, construction. Those are probably the biggest ones. But you mentioned restaurant, healthcare. You're talking about nail salons, stuff like that. How does this happen?
So when we think about trafficking, we want to think about it in terms of work and choice. So people are working in industries, but they don't have the freedom to leave. They're either forced, frauded, or coerced to engage in that work. So a good example is you can work on a farm, or you can be forced to work on a farm, or indebted to an employer for a particular reason. And so a person feels like they can't leave. It happens because we allow it to happen. Society has a demand for these services. If a person who's trafficking another person doesn't have evidence against them that they forced that person to work or frauded that person to work or coerced that person to work, then that person could maybe experience, a lower crime like wage theft or labor abuse. They may not meet the prosecutorial definition of trafficking if those means aren't acquired. So how does it happen? There's a demand for it. There's a vulnerable population of people who engage in this work and may not know their rights. People engage in this work because they often feel like there's no other choice. There aren't other options for them, whether those are economic options, they have financial and social needs they need to meet. And so they take jobs that are less favorable than others. So there are a lot of what we call push factors into working in labor exploited economies. And there's also what we call pull factors. There's a demand for it.
With the victims, do they tend to be men or women? Is it a mix when it comes to labor trafficking?
So the International Labor Organization estimations of labor trafficking prevalence that dates back to 2012 looks at this, and the answer is it's pretty close, 50-50. It just may be that men are engaged in particular types of work that women may not be. So, for example, a woman may be more likely to be in forced domestic servitude, forced housekeeping, or forced childcare work. And a man may be more likely to work in construction because of their physicality. But when it comes to, let's say, agricultural work or forced traveling sales crews, those numbers may be more 50-50. So we think that men and women are exploited at the same rate. When it comes to sex trafficking, we think women are probably exploited closer to 70-30 women to men, which is important because I think people perceive sex trafficking as a female-only phenomenon. And we think that probably somewhere between 30 and 36% of persons trafficked for sex are men and boys.
Wow. We're going to talk about sex trafficking numbers in a few minutes as well. But with labor trafficking, you keep saying it's the demand, right? And that almost falls on us as listeners, as people who live here. So what can we do to help lower these numbers before we get to the city solutions? What's on our shoulders to help with this?
So be mindful. So this conversation that we're having today. So I'll give you an example. Let's say you want to employ someone for domestic work or agricultural work. Are you working with a middleman, a person? Is that person been vetted? Are you allowed to interview the employee without that sort of quote middleman or other person in the room? Asking the client or the employee, are you receiving your wages in other places where you've worked, or somebody else receiving those wages? Have you ever been in a condition where you had to live where you work and you were not allowed to leave? When we go to places who employ others, we can ask those same questions. We can ask the people offering us health and beauty services, are you getting your wages? Are you being paid? Do you know your rights? Do you know the numbers you can call to ask for help? And so if we start having these conversations, if we start reporting them, if we're concerned that people are not, I don't want everybody, running around to places, interviewing people about their labor practices. But the goal is to inform the consumer. Are the things we're buying and are the products we're using being offered by forced labor? And if we suspect they are, who do we call and what do we do?
Yeah, who do we call and what do we do then?
So there are lots of different hotlines that are available. There's the National Human Trafficking Hotline. That's what's called the Polaris Project. And that number is really easy to remember. It is 1-888-37-37-888. You can call that number. You can also text. So maybe you're in a situation where you can't make a phone call. So you can text Be Free 233-733 and text that number and say, I am in this situation. I suspect somebody may be being forced to work here. You can call Rescue America phone number 713-322-8000. So there are a lot of local hotlines you can call. We recommend people call and report these things and not try to intervene on their own for safety reasons.
Welcome to the Flash Finds podcast, the world's fastest podcast where we explore how Facebook can help you with the stuff you're into. I'm your host, Emma Rogue, and today I'm with creator and chef Chris Cho. Chris, what do people get out of your reels?
So people are super intimidated when they want to first try cooking Korean food, but through Facebook Reels, I make it super fun and easy and accessible within a 30 to 60 second video.
Reels is the cheat code. Thanks, Chris. See you next time on the Flash Finds podcast, all about discovering the stuff on Facebook you care about. Bye.
A new equation for switching on outcomes is here from PwC. It's human-led and tech-powered. It's PwC with Oracle, SAP, Salesforce, and Workday. It's PwC with Microsoft, AWS, and Google. Simplify your systems and amplify your results. Switch on outcomes with PwC and their alliances. Learn more at pwc.com.
We've seen a lot of big headlines about the city and local law enforcement taking action against sex trafficking. We don't see those when it comes to labor trafficking. Are we doing enough as a community, as a city, with local law enforcement to help with the issue of labor trafficking?
So the answer is yes. When we first approached the city of Houston with our idea to include a public health response to human trafficking, they were very receptive to it. They also had already been engaged in outreach in the labor space. And so they do a lot of education and outreach when it comes to labor trafficking and sex trafficking. So that includes educating people about their rights. I can tell you that, even since I've started this work, I've noticed signage. If you go to a nail salon, for example, 10, 15 years ago, there were not signs in the bathroom and at the front door about labor trafficking. Now, when you go to a nail salon, those signs are everywhere. So there's requirements to have signage in particular industries and in places and to educate employees. So I think that we're moving in the right direction. It's a very difficult thing to overcome. And so like any social difficulty, it is not being ignored. And so I think it's important to treat labor trafficking as important as sex trafficking.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that things are being done and those steps are being taken, right, to inform not only the consumer, but the person that's working there. That is so good to hear. I want to move to sex trafficking because it has been a major story in our city. And the city has taken a lot of steps. And as I've mentioned, law enforcement has as well. What challenges do we still face, though, when it comes to lowering our sex trafficking numbers here?
So Houston and Texas have done some very unique things when it comes to sex trafficking. I'll give you an example. Now buying sex and sex of a minor has a higher charge. So sex buyers are being criminalized with a higher charges, felony charges, as opposed to misdemeanor charges. And that bill passed in 2022. And it's one of the first states to criminalize the buyer. I think there are a lot of barriers to identifying trafficking. There are not a lot of what we call indicia of trafficking on the law enforcement side that can help a law enforcement officer differentiate from prostitution from trafficking in the real space out in the community. So the addition of public health interventions have been a great arm to help identify and respond to sex trafficking. Clinicians and health workers being educated about sex trafficking and screening for trafficking and being able to identify the exploitation in clinical settings has been a unique arm in addition to the strategy that the city has offered. There are sex crimes teams in the Houston Police and have been for a while. There are particular interests in, of course, exploring minors who are involved in this work. There have been a lot of changes to how people buy. Remember, 20 years ago, we didn't have social media and cell phones. So, involving technology and AI into these solutions have been unique interventions in identifying trafficked persons. So, I think that we are doing the best we can. We have a lot of resources that other cities don't have. So, for example, we have drop-in centers, harm reduction model centers. We have shelters that protect trafficked persons. The state of Texas even has shelters for trafficked men and boys called Bob's House of Hope up in Dallas. So Texas is doing a really good job in leading solutions to reduce the vulnerabilities of persons being trafficked and also to identify and respond to their needs.
You said something really fascinating, and it also matches up to an episode we've done on CityCast Houston where we had Pooja Lodia on, and she was talking about victims of prostitution and sex trafficking on Bissonnette, and they were girls from the Houston area, right? And you mentioned that a big number of the victims are from here, from the city. How do they get coerced into this, and what challenges does that face, for law enforcement and solutions to help these victims out?
Well, when you think about, what coerces a person to be a victim of trafficking, we think about it what we call a socio-ecological model. So there has to be individual risk factors. Maybe that man or woman had a lot of adverse childhood events. Maybe they have housing insecurity or food insecurity. Maybe they're a gender or racial minority. Maybe they are a systems-involved youth. Maybe they have a cognitive or a physical disability. So there's an individual risk that makes someone vulnerable, but then there's also relational and community and social risks. So maybe there's a demand for it. They don't have a trusting adult that can protect them. They may not be educated about what trafficking is and may not know that what they're doing is, number one, against them, and number two, that they have any sort of choice. They may be in a community where there's organized crime leaders. Maybe there's not a lot of resources in their community. I mean, there's the Bissonnette area where there are drop-in centers, but there's also other areas of town where trafficking occurs and they may be less resourced. And then there's social norms and perceptions. I mean, people, dress up for Halloween as a pimp. I mean, I always think to myself, who wants to dress up as a trafficker for a costume? And so I think that we normalize violence and sexual violence in a way that is difficult to reframe.
When the city starts cleaning up areas like Bissonnette or other hotspots, does that help lower the numbers, or does that just spread out the issues and it, spreads the victims out to other parts of the town? What have you seen in all of your research and in just being around it all with the anti-trafficking program?
That's a good question. We use the word cleaning up a street or cleaning up a city. And, we have to be careful about our language because that implies that what people are doing is dirty, that the area is dirty. So we should always be mindful that a lot of these people feel a lot of shame and guilt around the work that they're engaged in. And so that by having to clean up the neighborhood implies that they're dirty people living there. So we want to be mindful of the language we use. But I do know what you mean by quote, cleaning up.
Good point. Yeah, no, thank you for correcting me on that.
But I think that that it sort of depends. Like, are we going in and, quote, cleaning up the area, meaning offering resources to these people, meeting their social needs? Are we offering housing and education and food and services and social services? And are we just physically removing them from the street? Because, to really support an area, we have to bring in services. We don't have to essentially remove people. And so we want to be mindful of what that means, because if we don't address those needs, we're just diverting it to somewhere else. Those needs remaining unmet will just have the same unfortunate outcomes of people being vulnerable to exploitation. So I think that's really what my understanding is what the city's strategy is doing, is trying to address those needs and not just physically move people. It's like homelessness. If you move a person from point A to point B, are you moving them out of the area so nobody can see that they're homeless, or are you housing them, right? So we want to be clear as to what a cleanup really looks like. And it really is addressing those social needs.
Can you tell me more about what you're doing with your work at the anti-trafficking program at Baylor College of Medicine?
Sure. So we like to stay in our public health and healthcare lane. We are not law enforcement. We are not prosecutors. What we're trying to do is reduce the harm that comes from labor and sex trafficking, whether that's physical harm, psychological harm, or social harm. So we do 4 main things in our program. We do a lot of education. We have trained nearly 10,000 healthcare professionals as part of our PATH collaborative team. The goal of training healthcare professionals is to educate them about what trafficking is, what it looks like, what makes someone vulnerable to exploitation, so that if they see a patient who they suspect is being trafficked, they can screen that person and then connect them to resources that can help reduce the physical, psychological, and social harm that comes from exploitation. That education, when we first started in our program in 2017, was voluntary. In 2019, the state of Texas passed a bill called the SB 2059 Texas bill that requires healthcare professionals or anybody who requires a license to offer their direct service to be required to get a training on human trafficking. And since 2019, there's been a lot more conversation in the healthcare space about trafficking because of that bill over the last 5 years or so. That being said, then what? If you educate a person about trafficking, what is that healthcare provider going to do? When we first started in the space, there were no validated screening tools for trafficked persons. So how do you screen a person who comes into a hospital or healthcare system for trafficking? Now we have validated screening tools for sex trafficking of children in emergency rooms and for sex trafficking of adults in emergency rooms. But we still don't have validated screening tools for labor trafficking. We've written some grants to try to get funding to do them. So that goes back to your question about how do you stop labor trafficking? We have to have validated screening tools developed to be able to identify labor trafficked persons. And so we're working on that. We have a clinical care model. So if a person who's a healthcare worker suspects or a patient discloses that they have been a victim of labor and sex trafficking and they're being served in the county, then in our program, we deploy a consult team that's made up of postdoctoral mental health providers, social workers, doctors, and we deploy that team to the bedside to evaluate a person in real time, and then we connect them to resources. We also do a lot of research on the topic, what makes people vulnerable to labor and sex trafficking, what sort of harm comes from labor and sex trafficking, how do we treat people who've been trafficked for labor and sex. And then we do a lot of advocacy work, both here in the hospital, at the city level, the state level, the national level, and the international level. So education, clinical care, research, and advocacy are sort of the 4 pillars of our program.
Why is it so hard to get a grant for labor trafficking protocols?
Because there's a lot of people trying to do a lot of work in labor trafficking. There's not enough funding for these projects. I mean, there's a lot of excellent researchers in the space across the United States. The Office of Trafficking in Persons, Office of Victims of Crime, the federal government does offer a lot of funding, but there is a lot of work that needs to be done. So private foundations stepping in would be wonderful, those sorts of things. But for now, they're, like any federal grant, are very competitive.
Dr. Gordon, before we let you go, what is one thing you want listeners to leave with regarding human trafficking in Houston from this interview?
Oh, that it happens in our society. And that if you are interested in learning more about it and what you can do, there are opportunities to get involved to help mitigate trafficking. So educating yourself as a citizen is the most important thing. And that this happens to our own Houstonians. I think there's this misconception that trafficking only happens to a certain group of people in other countries, that it doesn't happen here in Texas, and it does. And then being a mindful consumer. Are you employing someone or working at an agency or a space where other people are being harmed or exploited? And what are your rights and who do you call?
Dr. Gordon, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
That was Dr. Mollie Gordon. I've linked all of the resources in our show notes. Next Thursday, we're continuing our 2-part series on human trafficking when we talk to a survivor of the sex trafficking trade and why it's important for her to help other victims. That will do it for today. Thank you for listening, and I hope you learned something new. That was so strange. I'm sorry. Like, my Chrome just crashed.
That's what you said. We lost the host. It's okay. It's usually me.
Oh, no.